morning, welcome to the view behind blue eyes. And I'll turn you around. I'm standing in a churchyard. It's not the normal location of the view behind blue eyes, and it's not really my bag, graves, unless there's some historical note, and there is some historical note in this graveyard that I wanted to come and talk about. And it has a connection to Benito Mussolini. Now, Benito Mussolini obviously was a dictator in Italy and was killed at the end of the Second World War by Italian partisans who felt that he'd betrayed their country with his fascist course and his tactics of taking them into the war. However, it's not Benito Mussolini I've come to see here today, because his body's not here. It's obviously in Italy, but somebody who may have affected the course of history had her plan gone correctly. I've come here to find the grave of a lady. Her name was Violet Gibson. Violet Gibson, the woman who shot Benito Mussolini. It's worth mentioning that the following facts I garnished from various different sources. It became obvious to me that the various source materials that biographed took different stances on their portrayal of Violet Gibson and her struggles with mental health issues. Some range from sympathy to empathy and even to apathy towards her. For my part, I felt that some artistic license may have been used by the authors of the source material. Therefore, I will quote the pop culture of Star Wars: what you're about to be told is true from a certain point of view. Violet Albina Gibson was born on the 31st of August 1876 in Dalkey, County Dublin. Her father was Edward Gibson, a wealthy lawyer and politician who ascended to the Lord Chancellorship of Ireland and became the first Baron Ashbourne. She was schooled at home. She studied music, the arts and French. As a child, she suffered bouts of scarlet fever, pleurisy and rubella. At 18, Violet was presented at Queen Victoria's court, and throughout the 1890s and the 1900s her movements were tracked across newspapers' social columns, where she appeared amongst the lists of highborn attendances at concerts, balls, receptions and sporting events. She had an interest in religion and philosophy. Her mother followed the Christian Science religion. Violet, however, was drawn to Catholicism and followed her eldest brother into the faith. A conversion to Catholicism left her alienated from her father's affections, and she moved to London in 1902. Spending time in Chelsea, she met and fell in love with a young artist. The two became engaged, possibly married. This is where the differences of the material comes in. Some say they were engaged, some say they were married. So two became engaged, married in 1908. Her fiancé or husband died suddenly in early 1909. Following this loss, she threw herself into her religion and travelled to Italy to visit holy sites. While there, she fell seriously ill with a fever. Her sister travelled to Milan to care for her for several weeks. She returned to England and moved to Devon. For a time, she seemed to have been happier, and with regular visits to Buckfast Abbey. Violet's father, from whom she was estranged, died in May 1913. Following a fall in Hyde Park. Violet attended his funeral. It was her first visit to Ireland since 1902. It was also her last. At the outbreak of the First World War, Violet became involved in the anti-fascist movement led by Sylvia Pankhurst and travelled to Paris to work for organisations promoting peace. The British government kept notes on her and watched her from afar. In 1914, she was diagnosed with Paget's disease, a form of cancer, and had to have a mastectomy. This left a 9-inch scar across her breast. In 1915, she became a disciple of the Jesuit scholar John O'Fallon Pope, who promoted the idea of holiness depending on a high degree of mortification. In 1916, she attended a retreat he gave in Northampton, where practices of self-mortification, wearing hair shirts, self-flagellation and fasting were required. In 1916, she undergo another surgery, this time for an acute appendicitis and peritonitis. This left her with a lifelong abdominal pain. Now, In 1922, her brother, Victor, died suddenly, following an apparent mental breakdown. Violet herself had a breakdown after his death and spent some time in a nursing home in Kensington. It's probably from this point that her mental instability continued. On her return to London, and in October 1923, she left the house in the middle of the night in her nightclothes and had to be returned to the house by 2 policemen. Shortly thereafter, she attacked her housekeeper's daughter Emily with a knife, slicing her hand. After this event, Violet was certified insane and removed to Hollowell Sanatorium in Surrey. Her notes from there stated that Violet was homicidal, detailing an attack on another patient. After 6 months, she was released into the care of her mother and her sister Constance. In November 1924, she went to Rome and took up residency in Our Ladies of Lourdes convent. Things for Violet didn't improve from there. On Friday the 27th of February 1925, after praying alone in a room, Violet shot herself in the chest. The bullet entered her body just above her heart and lodged in her shoulder. When found, she said that she wanted to die for the glory of God. Refusing to return to England, which would likely mean her being recommitted to a mental institution, she entered the Villa Giuseppe clinic in Rome as a voluntary patient to recover from her injuries. It was now a month before an assassination attempt on Mussolini, and in the month before the assassination attempt, Violet's mother passed away and she suffered more mental anguish from her grief. On the 7th of April 1926, Violet, having procured another revolver, set out to assassinate Mussolini. On the day of the assassination attempt, she left the convent she was staying in after breakfast. Violet was armed with her revolver wrapped in a black veil and a rock for smashing Mussolini's car window if it needed. Mussolini, only 3 years into his rule. Violet took her shot at the Palazzo di Convertori, where Mussolini had just emerged after giving a morning speech to the Internal Congress of Surgeons. The dictator was walking amongst the crowds, and they cheered him, shouting "Viva il Duce!" Joining the crowd, she raised a gun and fired once. In a moment of luck, Mussolini moved his head back in the same moment to acknowledge the crowd's adoration. The last-minute head movement saved Mussolini's life, and the bullet whizzed past his face, merely grazing his nose. Violet attempted a second shot, but the bullet stuck in the chamber. There was blood pouring down Mussolini's face, and he staggered back, but managed to stay standing. As Mussolini was led away bleeding, the crowd turned on Violet and she was nearly lynched. The police wrestled her from the angry crowd. Battered and bruised, she was taken to prison and formally arrested. Mussolini was only wounded slightly, dismissing the injury as a mere trifle. And with his nose bandaged, he continued his parade. Mussolini wrote of the attempt on his life. "Fancy a woman," he exclaimed. Mussolini had declared that he was ready to die for a beautiful death, but an ugly old repulsive woman who came from abroad in groups was absolutely not the kind of person he wanted to be killed by. Throughout her interviews, Violet gave different responses to the questions put to her, denying she shot Mussolini at all, and then admitting she did shoot Mussolini to glorify God, who had kindly sent an angel to keep her arm steady. The press portrayed her as a confused eccentric in the grips of religious mania, rather than a would-be assassin. Her time in an asylum was emphasised, and her motives were never depicted as political. Her family and the British authorities were keen to promote this narrative. In an interview, her sister Constance cited a combination of her devout Catholicism and her distress at recent family deaths as the ultimate cause for her actions. Depending on the source materials that are available to read, she never revealed her reasons for the assassination attempt, or as mentioned in one account, in June 1926, succumbed to pressure, Gibson apparently made an alleged confession. Her story: she had committed the crime to impress an Italian duke named Giovanni Colonna, who she had fallen in love with years before in Switzerland. Colonna had actually served in Mussolini's government until forced to resign in 1924, after which he became opposed to fascism. Violet claimed that Colonna communicated a desire for Mussolini's death before gifting her a gun with bullets. The authorities, however, were not convinced. Shortly after this alleged confession, Violet reacted to a taunt from a fellow prisoner, attacking them with a small flower press hammer. She was transferred to an Italian asylum for the mentally ill in July 1926. There she experienced better living conditions, but subject to in-depth physical and psychological appraisal. The doctors describe her mistrusting and a lover of isolation, who closely guarded her independence with a disregard of the counsel of others. She never expressed any remorse for the shooting. After some negotiation and insurances from her family, she was deported to Britain after 18 months of incarceration in Italy. Released without charge at the request of Mussolini, for which he received the thanks of the British government. The assassination attempt had triggered a wave of popular support for Mussolini, resulting in a rapid pro-fascist legislation which helped him consolidate his control of Italy. Violet's sister Constance escorted her back to England. Gibson was taken to Harley Street, where a doctor certified her insane. She was then committed here in Northampton at St Andrew's Hospital. At St Andrew's, she spent her last years in a state of isolation, with Constance her only visitor. After a series of breakdowns, attacks on other patients and staff, and a suicide attempt in 1930, attempting to hang herself with a rope made from collector strips of cloth, she became calmer, finding some comfort amongst the birds in the hospital gardens. She wrote many letters to petition her for her release, to her family, to Winston Churchill, once Mussolini had fallen from grace, and to a young Princess Elizabeth. The letters were never passed on. Mussolini, of course, joined the Axis powers of Italy's Third Reich during the Second World War. You have to think, had Violet not missed, what might have happened. Mussolini and his mistress were captured in April 1945 by partisans trying to flee to Switzerland. Both were shot, and their bodies were hung upside down from a lamppost in a petrol station in Milan. It is unclear if Violet ever learned of this. After 29 years in St Andrews, Violet died, aged 79, on the 2nd of May 1956. Her death was not announced in the press. No family or friends attended her funeral, and she was buried here in Kingsthorpe Cemetery in Northampton, a stone cross bearing just her name and the years of her birth and death. So the reason that I'm here in the graveyard, which isn't my forte, is to find the final resting place of Violet Gibson, the woman who shot Mussolini. And here it is. So here's Violet, the woman who very nearly, wouldn't have stopped, but very nearly changed slightly the course of World War II. Violet Gibson, here in Northampton, and Northampton's connection to Benito Mussolini, the woman who shot Benito Mussolini. So there you go. Bit different. Don't normally do graveyards. Not my forte. But I felt it was a bit of history that I wanted to come and see where this lady was laid to rest. And yeah, get my view on it. I got my view, and my view is the view beyond blue eyes. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Bye bye.
Talk to me, Goose.